The baby's scream cut through the marble like an alarm. It peeled away the hush of the mansion, stripped the sound from the chandeliers, and left everyone standing, suddenly accountable to a noise they had the power to ignore, and did not. For a moment the corridor was only white light and sound. A fine line of sunlight down the center of the floor. The echo of impossible small lungs. The scent of talcum and lemon polish. People froze. The footman, the housekeeper, the men in dark suits, each face turned toward the sound as if it had a name. At the far end of the hall, a doorway opened. The man in the doorway was a shadow, pinned in a tailored black suit. Tahian Choi. He did not hurry. He did not scowl. He simply walked toward the cry with the same sure pace he used when stepping into a room to take command. He listened. When he reached them, the infant stopped mid-wail and blinked at him. The baby's cry rattled once more, softer, then stilled. Something unnameable passed over Tahian's face, less a smile than a refraction, and the child crawled forward, straight into his arms. She tucked her cheek against his thigh as if she had always known that knot was safe. Within seconds, she was asleep. Everyone held their breath for what should follow. People like rules. People like punishments that fit the offense. Kesha Williams braced herself for the inevitable consequence of noise in a house that ran on fear, dismissal, humiliation. A ledger closed. Instead, the man who ran the ledger cradled her baby and looked at her as if he were seeing not a worker but a person someone could be trusted with. She had not known how to speak in the presence of people who could annihilate your life with a word. Her voice came out small. "Elise," she said, as if naming the child would anchor the scene in something ordinary. "She's mine." Tahian handed Elise to her, and the baby grabbed the edge of his cuff. Tiny fingers curled around the thin fabric. She would not let go. She looked up at him, then back at Kesha, and as if answering a question none of them had asked, she reached and wrapped her fist around Tahian's thumb and refused to let it go. That small refusal rearranged the room. Kesha had been 80 the night she left college early, the semester books boxed by her bed, the scholarship a memory of someone else's plan. Single, student, newborn. She still smelled faintly of the hospital and disinfectant long after she left. The mansion had been a job of practicality. Keep the floors polished, keep the household in order, keep her daughter safe. She had not expected mercy. She had not expected the hand that took her daughter's attention would change the calculus of her life. Tahian knew the power of a look. He knew how to make a stockholder, a minister, a rival stop mid-sentence with a single tilt of the head. He had not known how to be seen by a child the way Elise looked at him, now neither with fear nor with calculation, but with something reminiscent of belonging. The look dug at things he had taught himself to hide. Grief, a picture in a wallet, a lullaby he half remembered. He put his thumb into the small fist and let the child keep it, because he could not, in that moment, imagine letting go. He surprised them twice. First, in the way he did not scold her for crying, and second, in what he said after. "She stays," he told Seo-jun. His voice even, businesslike, but different. It had always been the most efficient voice in the room. "Kesha will come upstairs to be my assistant. Full-time, live in the apartment above the garage. Salary will be increased. On-site childcare." He looked at Kesha then. "You will be paid tonight's wage and a month's advance. You will have help. Mrs. Chun will arrange the schedule with Ms. Heng." Kesha blinked, felt the floor tilt. The rest of the staff murmured. Seo-chun's eyebrows rose. Mrs. Chun, who had been with the family for 20 years, and had a face that could flatten a rumor, folded her hands. Ms. Hong, who once served in intelligence, and who had a way of moving that suggested storyboards and contingency plans, nodded only once. Her nod said, "I will keep watch." "You don't have to accept," Tahian added. The sentence was more generous than it needed to be. She did not answer at once. On the walk back to the modest staff quarters down a service stair she could hear the sound of her own pulse, and the infant, in the sling against her chest, the little head a warm weight. She thought of the bills waiting at her tiny kitchen table, the unpaid medical visits, the rent that was more than she could imagine skipping. She thought of being watched, a million eyes cataloging the way she held a glass, The way she brewed coffee, the way she chewed her words. She thought of her mother gone, years and waves ago on. The way her hands had always smelled of pepper and mothering. She thought of exhaustion as a constant. She accepted. She was practical where he was ceremonial. That fit, in some odd way. He offered her security money, a roof, and personnel to handle what should be handled by someone with less to fear. She negotiated the small things with surprising anger. An extra day off every week. An annuity saved for Elise's future. The apartment lease in her name. He agreed to all of it. Agreements were another language he spoke well. But she would not agree to become invisible. "You will do my calendar," he told her 3 days later in his office. The walls lined with art and a small, impeccably locked case of handguns behind bulletproof glass. "You will read people for me. You will keep Elise's routine. You will tell me when I miss something. And you'll tell me when you've hurt," she said, because the courage to speak truth was an armor in itself. He only looked at her, and something softened his jaw. That winter, the mansion rearranged itself around the baby. The staff, who had been trained in the art of telephone silence and controlled footfalls, adapted. There were small rebellions. A bright blanket folded just so, a jar of cookies left where the child's hand could reach, the chief gardener stretching the fence a few inches so a walk in the leaded garden would be less sharp for a stroller. Tahian adapted less obviously. He would not bring Elise into the full light of his life. She never entered the locked study where the case of weapons was displayed like a grim medal yet. He found reasons to be nearby. He attended some of the morning feedings, awkward with a bottle in his hands, until Miss Hang showed him the right angle. He learned the way Elise liked her hair moved aside, and he moved it gently, because the gesture felt like amends to a younger self. Kesha watched him from the kitchen doorway one night as he stood with his palm flat on a photograph. The face of a young woman looking back like a possibility that had been clipped away. She had seen him give orders, seen men fall silent at his call, but she had never seen that small, private motion. "Sister," he told her when she asked, not unkindly. The word was small and heavy. "That's why?" she asked. "Because of her." He did not say thank you. He did not need to, but he showed her the photograph, no names. Only a laugh in the corner, and the room that had been locked against softness seemed to breathe. Kesha's work became, as he had said, a study in observation. She sat beside him in meetings, with CEOs who tried to negotiate numbers, as if numbers could be lined up like soldiers. She sat through a tense breakfast with a man who represented a syndicate from Tokyo, a man whose smile never reached his eyes. She learned the calibrated silence that signaled a gathering storm. She learned to note the way Taeyeon's fingers twitched when a lie was told, and the way he would look at a man's shoes when deciding whether to trust him. Once, late in the second month, Taeyeon asked her to watch a negotiation and tell him what she saw. "Not the words," he said. "The small things, the tick, the breath, where the line nests." She told him, and he altered a concession mid-syllable, because she had noticed how a rival's voice faltered when threatened with exclusion. In return, he would occasionally make coffee the wrong way over steeped and leave a small, half-formed sentence for her to finish. Those crumbs were training in a different language. Civility woven through control. They were also gifts. Kesha, who had learned to be invisible, found a place to stand in the world of men who expected immediate obedience. Elise grew into the house like a piece of honest furniture, oddly fitting, stubbornly present. She refused other laps. She refused the nanny's suggestions on some days, preferring Taeyeon's voice. She reached for him in crowded rooms where whispers sclerosed the air. Once, in the servants' mess, she sat up in her high chair and slapped both palms on the table as if announcing an opinion. The room laughed the kind of laughter that rolls out only when fear loosens its grip by a fraction. The laughter did not erase the truth that Taeyeon's life was carved by other things. It did not pretend he was safe. It only altered the shape of the world around him. There were rituals. Every Sunday before the daylight peeled outward, Taeyeon would bring Elise down the back stair into the kitchen and sit at the small table while she gnawed on toast. He did not eat toast. He watched her as if watching proof that small things could be kept from harm. Seo-jun would stand at the door with intelligence reports stacked like clean plates. Ms. Hang would pace the garden with a methodical step. "Mrs. Chun would arrange fresh fruit on a bowl and then take extra care not to meet Taehan's eyes too long. The staff began to refer to Keisha as assistant now in private, and rarely returned to the old idea of her merely as housekeeper. The titles were small, but real. An acknowledgement. A line drawn in sand showing new territory. Kesha used the space cautiously. She still cradled Elise at night in a cramped apartment above the garage that Tahian had paid for in one of those. Gestures he understood well are resources. Do not change people, he believed, but they remove excuses. Despite his wealth and the gravity that hung around him, Taehan remained enigmatic to most. He kept a case of guns behind his desk, a pragmatic fact of a man who lived with threads. He never used them in front of Elise. He folded them into steel and glass, the same way he folded his past into a drawer. The staff accepted it because some habits are just that. Necessary inconveniences given a hard name. And yet, beyond house order and routine, there was an increasing noise beyond the walls. Kim, the rival whose name they rarely said aloud, had moved in patterns like storm clouds in a map. Rumors had become reports. A parcel of violence like a weather system gathers, and Seo Chun's face drew hard lines when he reported increased chatter. A meeting in downtown that had been cancelled, a courier who had failed to appear, a shot fired at a petty extortionist, to neighborhoods over. Taehan listened, and when he listened, he put a hand on Kesha's shoulder, as if to say quietly that this was not ordinary concern, but a tidal change. You should consider leaving for a while, Seo Jun suggested one evening. The suggestion carrying a weight Taehan had trained out of his voice. Seo's hands were precise, practical, the hands of someone who calculated survival down to the second. Just until it cools. Kesha considered. For the first time since acceptance she said, "No, I have Elise." Her voice had a steadiness that was partly defiance and partly calculation. She had negotiated safety into place. She had Elise and wages and Ms. Hang's presence. She had, in small but accumulating ways, a life that would not be easily reset. Taehan watched the exchange. He had learned the language of threats, the code that turned rumors into vendetta, but he had also learned how to offer sanctuary. He did not force her decision. He respected it the way he respected other things he could not control, by altering the immediate environment to reduce risk. He doubled the night patrols. He installed an extra layer of locks and made sure Elise's nursery window had armored glass. He added a second line of encryption to the mansion's perimeter cameras because some things required an over-solution. Some nights he sat in Elise's doorway and listened to her breathe. Sometimes Kesha would find him there. A figure in the dim, slow as a clock. "You don't owe her this," she told him once, not meaning the material things but the tender attention, the way he leaned toward an infant and softened. He looked at her then and said, simply, "She didn't know to be afraid of me." That answer lodged itself in Keisha like a splinter. It explained and it unsettled. It revealed a man who, for all his control, had been conditioned by loss. She learned, in stolen moments, about a sister who had died young, by choices the adult Taehan could not undo. He kept that grief private and ritualized it. A small music box he opened rarely. The photograph he polished, as if his hands could smooth edges. When he showed Kesha the photograph there was nothing theatrical in the reveal, just an allowance. A proof that he had a life that predated the man others feared. Their arrangement shifted, slowly, like a current bending a river. Kesha, who had come in to scrub floors and keep children from crying, became a resource he could rely on. He sought her opinion on small matters. The wording of a note, the cadence of a thank you to a donor. Her words had newly calibrated value. He listened to her without impatience. At the same time, she watched him measure the world with a currency of force that made her pulse quicken. In the whisper of guess, the tilt of a pen, she felt the wedge of what her daughter's life might mean in this orbit. Then, one late afternoon in early spring, frost still lurking in the corners of the province, a courier arrived with a package addressed to Taehan. The envelope had the wrong courier stamp, the sort of small error that usually meant nothing, and yet Seo Jun took one look and paled. "They used the wrong courier," Seo Jun reported. "Amateurs, usually. When amateurs make a mistake, Professionals watch the fallout. Taehan opened the envelope in his own private room. Inside was a photograph of the mansion's rear entrance taken from a distance and dated that morning. There was a single line written in black ink across the margin. The child makes him weak. Everyone in the room knew that adjectives like weak were rarely used as criticism in this world. They were the kind of taunt that announced intent. The line was not a threat, spelling out method. It was a promise thin and cold. Kesha felt a cold that was not the weather. She put Elise down to take the package, hand steady because moving shows less fear than standing still. Taehan watched her, but his eyes did not relax when she returned Elise to the sling. He stood up slowly, like someone preparing for a long run. "We will increase surveillance," he said. "Miss Hang will move into your apartment at night. SEO coordinate with the men. Mrs. Chun, you will rotate staff so nothing appears obvious." They arranged their defenses like a town that knew siege. The house glowed with more lights. Patrols took thicker routes. A driver who had been there for years was given a new sedan and the task of driving a circuitous route to throw off any watchers. Nothing they did was theatrical. Everything was a small, deliberate stitch, meant to keep a seam from bursting. Keisha had felt fear before there was a type of fear that comes from being too poor to walk away and a different type that comes from standing at the edge of someone else's violence. This latter fear had no easy remedy. The knowledge that someone would want to hurt Elise because they saw Taehan softening as leverage made her want to run. But running would mean leaving a grid of promises and resources she had only just claimed. It would mean leaving Elise's life to chance again. She made coffee and sat by the window with the baby in her lap. And Taehan stood in the doorway watching the two of them like a sentinel surveying what he would not lose. "If they try something," he said quietly, "we will be ready." She looked at him then with the practical calm she had trained into herself. "We won't be reckless," she said. "We won't make decisions that put Elise at risk to prove a point." He considered the line. He could be both reckless and meticulous. He had been both throughout his life, but he heard the truth in her words. He gave a nod that was nearly a command to himself. Careful. 4 weeks afterward, the house moved like a living thing in preparation. The gardener left soft paths. The nanny tested routes for evacuation. The men practiced exits and re-entries that were dull and precise, a choreography of survival. Taehan made sure the cameras were angled to eliminate blind spots. He installed an extra lock on the nursery door and a pressure sensor mat in the corridor. He never once explained the specifics. Systems did not require explanations. And through it all, Elise grew more daring. She began to walk unsteadily, with the defiant wobble of the very small land when she stumbled. She found Taehan's hand before she hit the ground. The first time she did that, he was working late in his private study when he heard the thud of little feet and then the muffled squeal of triumph that passes for a child's victory. He left his papers and went to the threshold. She saw him and extended a hand without hesitation. She would not let it go. That small insistence became a pattern. In moments of chaos, the baby found him. In rituals of safety, she kept his thumb in her fist like an anchor. The staff noticed. Kesha noticed. Taehan felt the shift himself, as if the world had been rearranged to make room for a different ending. The day the attack began, the sky pressed a flat gray across the city. The mansion was quieter than usual. Taehan had taken to walking the perimeter himself that morning. Boots, silent on gravel. He had the photograph in his pocket. The child makes him weak, and it sat like a stone. Seo-jun watched the rear gates with eyes that catalogued patterns. Miss Hang had been sleeping in Keisha's apartment for 3 nights, running valet of vigilance. Mrs. Chun hummed quietly in the kitchen, while Elise and Kesha snacked on apples. The small domesticity seeming, for now, to be a shield. Taehan gathered his men in the study. He spoke in phrases like a surgeon. Timing, clearance, fallback. He delegated with an efficiency that had kept him alive when lesser men had perished. He did not raise his voice. "We do not invite risk," he said, "but we will not be surprised." They moved like a machine into position. Guards took stations. Cameras were checked. Seo-jun walked out into the corridor and tilted his head to listen. The house held its breath for no drama. It prepared. At 3 in the afternoon, a distant sound pricked the air. An engine that did not belong to the staff, a truck that had no right to be idling in the lane. Io-jun closed his eyes for 2 ticks, then issued the command that made a dozen men pivot like a single organism. Taehan went down the back stair himself, quick and silent. Keisha, who had been rewriting a schedule at the kitchen table, felt the motion in the house like an animal that knows blood has been spilled and will smell it soon. She gathered Elise, checked the sling, and waited for instruction. Ms. Hang met her eyes and gave her the single nod that meant now. They moved through the service entrance, down the corridor where paintings watched them in frames. Taehan's men were already at the rear gate. There was an idiom to fear. There was also a choreography to safe retreat. The staff knew their doors. The guards knew their lines. Elise kicked her feet in the sling and babbled, unaware of adult calculations. Then the sound that meant something had become irrevocable. Glass breaking in the distance. The sharp percussion of a window under force. The house, which had practiced composure for weeks, understood the difference between practice and reality. The first real alarm sounded brief and brittle. Taehan's mouth set. He cupped Elise's head for a fraction of a second and then placed her in Keisha's arms. He did not hug the child in the way a man might to claim consolation. He passed her with the same deliberate motion he used for other things. Precise, accountable, sincere. "To the panic room," he said, and his voice was not the voice of a man asking, but the voice of someone telling. He looked at Keisha. "Lock the door behind you. Don't look back." Keisha's hands did not tremble. She moved with the industry of one who has learned to make miracles of small things. She hustled toward the corridor that led to the reinforced door. Ms. Zhang and 2 guards flanked them. The nursery door closed behind them. The heavy bolt slid home like a verdict. There was one more beat as the staff funneled into the safe route. Taehan stood in the doorway for a single second, his silhouette carved into the dim. He did not rush. He did not flee. He stepped forward toward the sound that had already crossed the property line and become more than threatening. The first gunfire snapped out like a branch underfoot, unexpected and loud. The house seemed to shrink. Keisha felt the impact of it more than the sound and echo in her teeth, a destabilizing fact that the world could be altered in an instant. She pressed Elise to her chest and moved, practiced and blind, toward safety. The baby clutched at Taehan's sleeve, then at Keisha's shoulder, then curled into the curve of her mother's neck. She would not let go. She would not let go. The panic room sealed around them with a sound like a tomb being shut. Metal and insulation swallowed the world. The only real thing left was the small, hot body at Keisha's breast and the sharp, mechanical voice of the door locking behind them. Inside, the walls were padded and clinical. A small window looked out through a reinforced view to the corridor where Boots had passed minutes earlier. The room smelled of disinfectant and the faint sweetness of baby powder. For the first time since the cry began, Keisha noticed the way her hands had tightened, knuckles white on Elise's back, the sling a tight cradle. Her heart moved like a trapped animal. Ms. Hang sat across from them on a fold-out chair, eyes flat, listening to the house through a network of sounds only someone trained to hear danger could decipher. One of the guards checked the latch and then stood with folded hands, jaw clenched against anxiety. "Do not speak above a whisper," Ms. Hang said. Her voice was low, but there was an instruction in it that made the room shrink to the size of the cradle. "Taehan will handle the rest." Keisha wanted to ask questions about how long, about their plan, about whether this was a direct message, but the words felt too large. She smoothed the hair from Elise's forehead and watched the baby's face, so small and serious, as if processing the world like an experiment. Elise blinked, then found Taehan's thumb in her own fist, as she had days before, and held it with the stubborn intensity of someone who believed fists could change outcomes. Outside the panic room, the house became a machinery of response. Taehan moved through rooms like a man who knew every turn by heart, a pathway through blueprints he had memorized in another life. He did not scream commands, he acted. Seo-jun coordinated men, voice near a whisper, the tone of a man who kept fury measured. Guards flowed into cover positions. Ms. Hang's contingency plans unfurled in crisp lines. Alternate routes, distractions, men posted where intercepts might happen. Mrs. Chun, who had been stacking fruit in the kitchen minutes earlier, was now a steel presence, offering a spare blanket to a shaking footman and disappearing to make tea for the men on duty. The first exchange of gunfire sounded like a stone underfoot sudden, explosive, bullets cut glass at the far wing. A lamp fell and shattered into a constellation. The sound kicked the house like a fist. Somewhere down the corridor a portrait fell forward and its frame fractured. Men answered with the practiced rhythms of those who had trained for violence as a necessary evil. Tahian did not fight as a lover of fighting. He fought because no other moral calculus made sense in that instant. There was an economy to his violence now. Precision, urgency, the movement of a man trying to corral a single, precious Verabellis back to safety. He issued orders like a surgeon dissecting a bleed. A man to the gate, 2 to the east flank, 1 to block the rear. He did not boast. He did not revile the attackers. He treated them as hazards to be severed. Keisha pressed Elise to her chest and remembered, with a clarity that made her nauseous, the photograph Tahian had shown her, the woman who had been his sister. She thought of grief as a container and of Tahian as a man who had learned to pour his grief into files and plans. The realization steadied her. This was not theater for him. This was rearguard action against something that had once taken his family. A blast shook the corridor. The panic room's small window rattled. For a heartbeat, the world outside seemed to collapse into a single point of sound and light. Kesha felt the floor under her tremor like a hand pulling. Elise's breath brushed her collarbone soft, quick. The baby's palm, still curled around Tahian's thumb, flexed like a thing that had decided. Then there was a different sound. Footsteps, measured and strong, laying a net outside the chaos. Sio Chun's voice came, clear and clipped, through the chain of command. Contain and sweep. No unnecessary risk to civilians, he said. The men moved like a single organism. They found the attackers in a glare of gunfire, in a burst of movement. Men fell, others ran. The attackers were surprised by the speed and coordination, and by the fact that the mansion was not an undefended prize. They had expected to land terror and profit from confusion. They had not expected a house that protected what mattered most to the man behind it. Tahian reached a stairwell and planted himself at its mouth, waiting for a flanking team to clear the next corridor. A silhouette moved at the edge of his vision. One of the attackers had forced a passage and now stood visible, gun wobbling. Tahian did not shout. He raised his own weapon and then lowered it in a move that was not casual. It was a calculation of containment. His aim did not seek an exit wound. It sought to disable the immediate hazard. The attacker stumbled and dropped his weapon, more stunned than injured, hands splayed. There was no celebration, only a professional removal of threat. But in the course of tactical clarity, a stray bullet found the wrong place. It clipped Taeyeon's side as he pivoted on ugly, unpredictable fact of violent chaos. The pain came as a hot, precise shock. He tasted iron, and then he felt something else, a familiar sensation of being given a new kind of limit. For a second he froze on the stair, then another man clamped a bandage, and a voice told him to stand and move and take the position. He did. He kept moving, because stillness in that house meant vulnerability. The attackers were repelled with a ferocity tempered by practical aim. By the time the last echo of gunfire died, the rear gate was closed and the men had taken custody of 3 assailants, their plans in shreds. The house itself breathed, and then shuddered like a living thing that had survived a fever. When Taehan reached the panic room, his face was ashen where the bullet had nicked him. His shirt was smeared with a dark halo. He did not go inside at once. He stood in the corridor, fingers pressed to his side, as if testing the geography of pain. Ms. Hang met him at the threshold, and her eyes were blunt in their appraisal. "You have to see a doctor," she said. It was not surprise in her voice. It was command rerouted into care. He shook his head tightly. "Not yet," he said. He did not speak of refusing help. He spoke of priorities. "How are they?" "Safe," she said. "Kesha is steady." Inside, Keisha stood when Tahian entered. The baby, unconcerned with the drama of grown men, had found a new place of trust. She had leaned up and placed one tiny hand against Tahian's cheek, her fingers pressing like a benediction. Tahian stumbled once at the touch as if electricity had moved through bone. "Elise," he said, and his voice broke in a way that stripped the weight off his shoulders and showed him very small and human. "Elise." The baby turned and, in a pure, uncalculated movement, tapped the edge of the dark stain on his shirt. Her fingers splayed and then she clapped lightly, fascinated by the pattern as if it were a new toy. "Da," she babbled an accidental sound, raw in its innocence, which landed like a bell inside Taiyun. Kesha blinked. Ms. Hang froze, eyes narrowing. For a wild instant, everyone misread the sound as a first word. Tahian bent until his face was level with the baby's. The pain in his side throbbed like a human metronome. Elise reached and clutched his jaw with inexplicable familiarity. There was no ceremony in the gesture, only gravity. Tahian's whole frame slackened in a sigh, so small it might have been mistaken for a release of breath. Then he made a decision in the way a man throws a stone. He pivoted on one heel and went to the stair. "I am going to the infirmary," he said. "Seo, watch the pasas. Ms. Hang, stay with them." He moved with that same economy of motion. The infirmary was a clean, antiseptic room, tucked under the old servants' wing, not far from where the staff ate. Mrs. Chun had already summoned the private physician Amon Tahian, employed for other reasons but whose skill had been documented in less public ways. The physician worked quickly, and the wound, while serious enough to command stitches and weeks of convalescence, was not mortal. There was blood, there was an ache, there was a realization made concrete. Tahian had a vulnerability now that made him human in a way that terrified and moved those around him. Kasha sat in the waiting alcove beneath the stair and felt the world reorganize into a ledger. Injuries, accounts, promises, dangers. She had held Elise through the crisis and felt the squeeze of the baby's fist into her chest, tiny and needless. And she had thought of the photograph Tahian had shown her, of the woman whose absence had shaped the man now limping past a hospital bed. When Tahian emerged with a bandaged side and a stooped gait, he did not walk straight to his office. He walked to where Kesha sat, and he folded into the chair opposite her with a tiredness that made him look young for the first time since she had known him. There was a bruise shaping around one cheek. He placed his gloved hand on the small of Elise's back and let the baby pat it like someone who had found a familiar place. "You are very steady," Tahian said to Kesha. It was not a compliment in the aristocratic sense. It was a recognition of professional competence that doubled as gratitude. He added, quietly, "I am sorry." "For what?" Kesha asked. Her voice was rough from tears. She hadn't allowed herself earlier. "For letting you be close enough that they could use you," he said. "For making this a target." She looked at him then, and something in her untangled. She had not wanted the life he offered to be a gilded cage. She had not wanted to be purchased for safety. She had wanted a choice. Her lungs found generosity and wore it like a new garment. "You could leave," she said. "We could go somewhere. You could pay for someplace far." Tahian looked at the baby, then at Kesha, and made a motion with his hand that was both practical and personal. "I will not hide her away," he said. "If you leave, you are leaving the things that help keep you safe. If you stay, I will do everything to make sure no one can use you like a weapon against me. But I will not make that decision for you." Kesha felt her resistance and her tiredness and her hope all balance on a pivot. Being offered sanctuary was one thing. Being asked to accept it as a mutual covenant was another. She had agency, no negotiated, hard-won. She looked at the bandage at his ribs, the way his hand hovered protectively over Elise, and she understood that the man behind the reputation had been changed by the baby's simple refusal to let go. That refusal had rearranged priorities. That refusal had the power to remake the ledger. "I will stay," she said. The words were soft, but they were hers. "For Elise? And because I think you will try." His face rearranged with something like relief and something like shame. He muttered a promise, not theatrical but sincere, to make changes. Increased security around the staff apartments, stricter controls, and offered to keep Ms. Hang with them until they all agreed it was safe to disperse. He insisted on transferring a portion of his personal security allowance into a trust for Elise's future, an annuity he would not speak of in public. He let Kesha keep Elise in her own name. He apologized again, a tiny gesture, and then rose as if the conversation had concluded. Days blurred into stitches and checkups. The house did not return to its former complacency overnight. There were therapy sessions for some staff who had been rattled. There were extra patrol shifts that smelled of coffee and heavy shoes. Taeyeon visited Elise often, bearing small gifts that were mostly practical blocks painted in bright colors, a hand-carved wooden horse things that somehow felt like reparations. He learned to sit on the floor and let the baby pull at his sleeve, to laugh with a sound that surprised him and made his chest unclench. Gradually, the danger receded from the immediate perimeter. Kim's move had been bad planning and worse luck. The attack was clumsy, and intelligence picked at its threads until the rival network was compelled to draw back. The men taken in custody faced consequences that the law might decide on its own timetable. Taeyeon's men efficient and cold handled the pragmatic fallouts. Keisha watched these events with a survivor's pragmatism. She did not celebrate justice. She recorded it in the ledger of things that had been done and could now be counted. It was in the quiet that the real alterations occurred. After the stitches had healed and the house eased back into its larger rhythms, Taeyeon found that he moved differently through rooms that held the echo of Elise's laughter. He would sometimes break a meeting early to watch the child sleep, as if he feared that anything too long a gaze might make her disappear. He left notes on Kesha's desk, small things. A reminder to pick up a toy, a message about a change in schedule. He never wrote anything that would diminish Kesha's voice in their arrangement. He asked. He listened. That was the true alteration. A man used to giving orders, now calibrating his day against the needs of a child and the agency of a mother. Keisha noticed changes in herself too. She walked with more confidence within the mansion's spaces. She used the extra income to enroll Elise in a small playgroup that met twice a week at a private facility in an attempt at normalcy. She pursued a class online on childhood development, a thing that made her feel useful beyond survival. She also learned to read the room in a new way. She could advise Taeyeon on small human details that he had not known to value. He listened. She appreciated that listening as a currency. Time is a clever artisan. 6 months later, the mansion had softened the edges, but remained formidable at its core. Elise, now a toddler, skittered around rooms with a reckless delight. She had hair that curled at the ends and a laugh like a bell. She refused strangers' laughs, still except for Taeyeon's butt. She had grown to offer smiles to the staff who had learned her rhythms. The apartment above the garage remained Kesha's. Her mailbox, her clothes, small plants on the sill, but the household had taken on a new shape. Meals were prepared with an eye toward a small pallet. A spare crib sat in Taeyeon's private quarters because he refused to be separated from the small life he had once thought belonged to others. Their world remained complicated. Threats lingered like shadow edges. Taeyeon's name still carried consequence, but something private had shifted. He had become a man who refocused his power into protection that included tenderness. The tenderness did not erase its origins. It simply redirected energy that had once been only about control. On a late summer afternoon, the household gathered for a small, ordinary celebration. Elise's first birthday. They had pushed back the furniture and the servants' mess to make room. Mrs. Chun baked a simple cake that smelled of warm butter. Seo-jun arrived with a small wooden toy box for Elise. Ms. Hang gifted a hand-sewn blanket with a careful stitch that held a map of roots in its threads. Taeyeon stood slightly apart, hands clasped, looking like a man at an unfamiliar altar. Kesha sat beside him. They had spent a dozen moments together by then that had altered the scaffolding of their relationship. A shared look when a toddler refused to eat. A silent agreement to change a staff rota, a quiet phone call when a blackmailer had been discovered and neutralized through legal channels. There had been no sudden confession of love, no dramatic falling to knees. Instead, there was a slow accrual of trust, a ledger tilted by small acts. As the cake was brought forward, Elise toddled towards Taeyeon with the single-minded hope of a child. Her steps were uncertain but intent. She reached him and planted herself at his knees, eyes wide and delighted. Tahian bent and scooped her up with care. She tucked her head against his neck and laughed. In that laugh, there was a history being rewritten. Tahian's handahan, that had once been associated with command and the finality of browbeaten, moved to the small of Elise's back in a gesture that could have been clipped from any father's playbook. Keisha watched him, and something like warmth rose in her chest. The power imbalance remained. It could not, and should not, be erased by small kindnesses. But the man who had once been a ledger clerk of fear now counted family among the things worth defending without calculation. Later, after the guests had gone and the house creaked into evening, Tahian and Kesha found themselves alone in the greenhouse, Tahian's chosen escape, thick with the scent of earth and leaves. He held a wrapped present that he had kept tucked in a drawer for weeks, a small music box he had bought at a market that reminded him, in an oblique way, of the one his sister had loved. He handed it to Kesha. She opened it with a careful finger, and a melody wound into the air, sweet and thin. "You don't have to," she began. "I know," he said, "but I want you to have it." He paused, and then added, "For Elise." Her fingers closed around the box. She looked up at him, and for once their eyes met without the usual sharpening of roles. The air between them was dense with possibilities and the memory of danger. She felt, under her ribs, the old reliance on her own tradecraft settle, negotiate, protect. She felt also the new possibility of an alliance formed not out of fear, but out of choice. They did not dramatize it. There were no words that made the moment sacred. He bent and kissed her forehead, not the theatrical kiss of lovers in novels, but a small, respectful press of lips on skin. Kesha did not pull away. She did not rush forward either. She let the moment be what it was, the quiet acknowledgement that two damaged people could choose to protect each other beyond the geometry of fear. Elise, awakened by the faint music, toddled into the greenhouse and planted herself between them. She reached up and grabbed Tahian's hand, fingers gripping the same thumb she had grabbed months before in the hall. A small, repeated ritual. She then surprised them both by taking a step and then another, wobbling forward with the raw concentration of a tiny daredevil. Kesha had her arms out before the child fell, but Tahian set his hands on either side, not to seize, but to guide. Elise took another step, and then another, and laughed, with a sound like wind. It was not cinematic in the grand sense. It was domestic and messy. Tahian's sleeve smudged with soil, Kesha's hair escaping its clip, a small pile of leaves on the floor. But in that small domestic tableau was the thing that had changed everything. A child refusing to withdraw, refusing to be frightened away from the man she trusted. She would not let go. Years could have argued with this change. Events might still have pulled them in ways that required difficult choices. But for now, the ledger had a new entry, less about owing and being owed, and more about shared dividends of care. In the months that followed, their life settled into a rhythm that acknowledged danger but prioritized normalcy. Tahian continued to run his operations with the same strategic coldness he always had, but he left certain rooms close to eye, places where Elise might enter, where laughter would be protected. Kesha took on more responsibilities beyond childcare. She coordinated family outreach for Tahian's philanthropic efforts, something that let her use both the practical skills that had kept her alive and a new capacity for influence. They negotiated their relationship with care. There were conversations about boundaries and privacy and the limits of his protection. There were also moments of intimacy that had nothing to do with power. A hand reaching for another in the dark. Shared coffee in the mornings. A joke about a burnt toast. The romance, if it could be called that, grew in small increments and was always consented to, always reciprocal. One quiet evening, some months after the birthday, Elise crawled into Tahian's lap on the old Chesterfield in his private study and reached for the scar on his side that had faded into a pale line. She pressed a finger to the skin and then looked up. "Papa," she said, "clear as day." Tahian's breath stopped. Keisha, standing in the doorway with a mug in her hands, felt heat flood her cheeks. For a moment, nothing else existed but the pronunciation of that small, earned word. He laughed, then a short, stunned sound, and then he moved and wrapped both their shoulders with his arms. It was not a claim. It was a pledge. Later, when Kesha tucked Elise into bed, she found Tahian standing in the hallway, hands folded, as if unsure what to do with newly minted tenderness. She walked over and slipped an arm around him. He leaned in, as if the contact confirmed something that did not need to be spoken. They stayed that way for a long time, listening to the house breathe, to the tiny feet padding in sleep, to the small, certain sounds of a family negotiating itself into being. In the end, the thing that altered Taeyeon's life was not just the act of the baby refusing to let go. It was what the refusal made him face, that there were lives he could protect without claiming ownership. That tenderness could be a kind of strategy, that being human could coexist with being powerful. Elise's clutch of his thumb had shown him a simple truth: someone could look at him and see a person. Behind the myth, and he had allowed that vision to reshape him. The title of the story was literal and true. His life changed when a baby refused to let go. She had held his thumb and, in doing so, had held open a door he did not know he wanted to walk through. She had tugged him from a ledger of fear into a ledger of care. The house remained vigilant, and the world outside remained nothing if not complicated. There were always risks, but within those walls, a small family constructed from necessity, tenderness, and hard choice. There were arguments and reconciliations, strategies and lullabies, negotiations over bedtime and security. There were days when Taeyeon's past knocked loud and ugly at the door, and days when Elise's small triumphs, first steps, first words, a fit of laughter outs, the old noises. On a late autumn morning, they posed for a photograph as a quiet ritual more than an act of vanity. Mrs. Chun stood behind the camera. Mrs. Chun was always the keeper of such moments, and Seo Jun hovered, protective and precise. Elise sat between Kesha and Taeyeon, a stubborn, delighted child. Kesha's hand rested on Taeyeon's knee, in a gesture that had become natural and chosen. Taeyeon, who had once been defined by the fear in others' eyes, smiled the way a man who has been surprised by mercy smiles, guarded, stunned, and a little undone. When the shutter clicked, Elise reached up and grabbed Taeyeon's thumb. He offered it freely. She refused to let go. If you loved this twist, like and subscribe for more stories like this.